Now, as far as guidance documents and or regulations for NEPA and addressing climate change in NEPA, again, we have absolutely no formal regulations at this time. The effort to create guidance goes back all the way to the administration of Bill Clinton in 1997. An internal draft was circulated among agencies at the end of that administration, but was never released to the public, and then the administration ended and it kind of went away for quite a long time. And then, as you heard this morning, there was a petition, about a 70-page petition that was submitted to CEQ back in 2008, urging that the regulations and the statute be revised to make clear that climate change should be covered under the law and to lay out procedures and guidance to do so. At the same time, also a NGO group and policy think tank here in Washington, the Center for American Progress, released a report that advocated for a presidential executive order essentially asking or requiring the same thing of federal agencies, that they cover climate change and address it in all major impact analyses. However, not a lot happened, at least immediately. This is a paper that I wrote with a colleague sort of in this void period, just trying to kind of lay out to agencies. There were a lot of federal agencies saying, well, there's no guidance, there's no regulations, so clearly we don't have to do anything. And given what was happening in the courts, as well as for other reasons, we basically thought that that wasn't necessarily the best approach in covering this issue. So we tried to write a sort of step-by-step process for how to think about this and incorporate it into impact analyses. And this is was published in the Journal of the National Association of Environmental Professionals, which is sort of the U.S. Version of the IAIA here in the U.S., the Journal of Environmental Practice. But earlier this year, in February, there were 3 different guidance documents that CEQ released on the same day at an event celebrating the 40th anniversary of NEPA on February 18th. And one of those 3 guidance, and the one that certainly got the most attention, was a draft guidance document on how to address climate change in NEPA analyses. About a 12-page document, and it lays out a framework. There's not necessarily a tremendous amount of specifics in it. It was released as a draft. It was open for a couple-month public comment period. There were several hundred comments received aggregate on all 3 of the guidance documents that were released. And as far as we know, the agency is still, CEQ is still reviewing the comments, and I have not heard a target date other than to expect sometime soon that we might see a final guidance document. One of the most controversial items in this guidance document was a number that was laid out for greenhouse gas emissions from projects, 25,000 metric tons. And that came from the EPA at the time, their Clean Act Air reporting rule that you heard about this morning. And the document was very vague on whether that number was supposed to be a threshold. In other words, if you were above it, then you were somehow supposed to analyze greenhouse gas emissions, but if you were under it, you were okay. And so they received a lot of comments on that. It'll be interesting to see how that changes with the final version. The document also made it very clear that they expect agencies not only to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but also to talk about climate effects on proposed actions, as well as on the resources that the actions are affecting as well. Probably the second most controversial part of the guidance was the last item on this slide, where basically the CEQ said, we're not going to provide at this time any guidance for land management agencies on how to address this issue. And that was a pretty big punt, if you will, because in NEPA analyses, if you sort of count them up, particularly the big environmental impact statements, of which there are about 500 or so done every year in the United States, by all the federal agencies combined, those land management actions from agencies like our Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, et cetera, probably make up about almost 2/3 of those larger analyses, and probably a similar number for all of the analyses altogether. So they received a lot of comment on that, and I imagine we'll see some revisions as well. But the CEQ also notes that whatever happens, this guidance will certainly change over time because it's obviously a changing issue. At the same time, CEQ has been coordinating with other federal agencies here in the U.S., like in a lot of other countries, as we've already heard about at this conference this morning, on climate adaptation. So they have a working group that's issued an interim report just a couple weeks ago. And so that's kind of laying out a process for integrating, in some ways, climate change and specifically adaptation into the impact assessment process. There also have been a series of presidential executive orders, probably the most important for this issue, on relating to greenhouse gas emissions that federal agencies are responsible for. And it actually sets out a monitoring and quantification system, as well as requiring agencies, all federal agencies, to set out greenhouse gas reduction targets. Although interestingly, buried in that executive order is this bolded item that actually appears to require that energy usage impacts and as well as alternatives be addressed in all federal facility environmental impact statements and environmental assessments. So I think that's an ongoing area. There also have been a number of federal agencies that, as I mentioned earlier, have now released their own either draft or final versions of climate change guidance. So for their own employees and contractors doing assessments within agencies like the Forest Service or the various Department of Interior agencies, basically to guidance on how to implement, or as you can see with the federal highways, sample language to insert into a document. All right, in closing, I just want to share with you a couple examples of early attempts to integrate in climate change analysis into some of our NEPA analyses here in the U.S. As Michael mentioned, I've been working the last couple of years on a series of environmental impact statements for our Department of Transportation, a sub-agency called NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration that regulates our fuel economy standards. The one I'm going to show you a few examples from was released in February of this year. It was the final environmental impact statement and rule for regulating all the passenger cars and smaller trucks, what we call the light truck segment here in the U.S., for about 5 model years, 2012 to 2016. And this was also unusually, for the first time ever, joint rulemaking, and for the first time ever, our Environmental Protection Agency regulating under their new power stemming from the Supreme Court case I mentioned earlier, regulating greenhouse gases emissions from mobile sources as well. So it was a joint rule to do both of those things. And so it was a pretty aggressive, for the time and given the history of the program, increase in the greenhouse gas emission standards. And this is a really important action from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint and climate change and impact assessment for 2 major reasons. One was this EIS stemmed from the court order from that CBD lawsuit that I talked about earlier. So the court actually ordered the agency, when they did the future rulemakings, said you have to do an environmental impact statement. Climate change is a significant impact, and you need to discuss it in full detail. And so that's what this EIS, building off one earlier at the tail end of the Bush administration, did. And it actually represented the first time ever that global climate modeling had been done for a proposed action, a single federal action, to try to ascertain effects on things like sea level rise and temperature change and precipitation change. The second major reason for the importance of this action probably is, if not the largest, one of the largest single federal actions to sort of be studied in NEPA for greenhouse gas emissions, because it represents just slightly less than 4% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, all the cars and trucks sold in the U.S., light trucks, represent about 3.8%, depending on the year you look at, greenhouse gas emissions. And as you can see, it's a large chunk of the U.S. Emissions itself. So what we did for the analysis here was to really look at 3 things kind of stemming from that court order. We calculated the greenhouse gas emissions, but again, we didn't stop there. Then we looked at how that would change CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, and then how that would then lead to changes in precipitation, sea level, and temperature. And then we said, we didn't stop there, we said, okay, then what will happen there? So if, for instance, EIS, if you look at it, has about 140 pages drawing very heavily from the IPCC reports, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, and other peer-reviewed sources on what are the major effects to be expected worldwide, which we certainly heard this morning in great detail in Dr. Watson's lecture. We used a global climate model that's widely available, publicly available, free to use. Some of you may have heard of, called the MAGIC model, to do the analysis. And I thought I'd just show you one graphic here One of the comments we had between the draft and the final EIS is a lot of people wrote in and said, hey, this climate change thing is new to me. I don't really understand it, and I want to see things in relation to, what's really happening on the ground. So here we did a comparison of the action alternatives, which are the lines on the top, and how their increase in the mileage standards would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in comparison to the red line, which was President Obama's announcement that the U.S. would commit to a 17% reduction in the U.S.'s total greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2020. But our modeling showed out in the year 2100, even though this is a very large action, that the effects to things like sea level rise and the other factors was barely measurable, and certainly my modelers would tell me well within the error bars of the model. And this just gives an example of some of the other graphics showing the differences in alternatives. So we kind of showed that you don't really see a lot here in terms of a choice for a decision maker. And then I mentioned to you the other analysis that we did. So you can find that EIS on the web at this website, or just do a search for the NHTSA, the CAFE program, the Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards. A very different project, well, let me just mention too that the agency actually just 2 weeks ago released yet the third EIS in this chain, and this is the first ever regulation for fuel economy standards and EPA regulating greenhouse gas emission standards for the other vehicles, the medium and heavy duty commercial truck fleet in the U.S. So that's out right now for public comment. That comment period closes at the beginning of January 3rd. A very different project, really quickly, is a project level project still going on in the state of Washington and Oregon, a bridge, an interstate highway bridge. Here, the greenhouse gas emissions, the effects from a global standpoint, way less, probably barely even measurable in a global standpoint. But the community here asked for an analysis to be done of different alternatives for replacing this bridge, how adding in light rail and other mass transit might affect greenhouse gas emissions. So they did that for the draft, and they're improving that analysis right now for the final. And then finally, a very qualitative approach, climate effects onto projects and onto resources. This is a oil gas development on the north slope of Alaska, the Bureau of Land Management. A lot of text here, but I just wanted to show you an example of an early very qualitative attempt to talk about how, again, climate change may in the future be impacting particular resources here, wildlife on the north slope of Alaska, and you can see some sort of the tempering language that the agencies are using. So hopefully that's helpful to you in knowing what's going on. I also wanted to mention that Michael's Climate Change Center also has an excellent resource in a compendium of EISs, or environmental impact statements in the U.S., that have actually addressed climate change. I think there's over 100 of them in a collection going back about 2 years, and so you can find that at this website here, and it actually tells you exactly what page numbers, what the analysis covers, where it's at. Really incredible resource. And so with that, hopefully that gives you an idea of what we're doing in the United States. We obviously have a lot more to do, and it will be interesting to see how this plays out. I think we're going to see a lot of change in the next year or two as well. So thank you.